What is an orca? On the surface, the question might seem simple, and in some ways it is. Orcas, or killer whales, are the largest member of the dolphin family, Delphinidae, making them dolphins. However, the family Delphinidae is under the parvorder for toothed whales, Odontoceti, making them dolphins and whales. And what about the orca's most common other name, the killer whale? If you take the name at face value, it's made up of an adjective, killer, which they are, and a noun, whale, which they also are. Although in the name, the noun whale doesn't refer to the animal that we're talking about. It refers to its prey. Ballenas asesinas is a Spanish phrase used for the animal, which literally translated means whale killer. It's a reference to populations of orcas that hunt other whales. Now this phrase throughout time and repetition swapped, becoming killer whale instead of whale killer. Now in the time we've already spent together, we've only gone through 2 of a dozen names this animal has. But, luckily, there's a lot more that we can go through together. And what better place to start than here, episode 1. My name is Fred, and I'm the Orca Man. And welcome to the world of orcas. Right. Orcas live in every ocean of the world, but no orca travels to every ocean. They are a global species, but populations have been distinct for hundreds of thousands of years. In order to distinguish these populations, we separate them into this thing called ecotypes. That is, a large subcategory determined by behavior, genetics, and hunting techniques. A few different aspects of the way in which these animals interact with each other. Within ecotypes, there are populations. And within populations, there are clans. And within clans, there are pods. Within pods, there are matrilines. Now, this order isn't exactly for every population, but it is the 5 overarching terms that are used to classify orcas into different groups. Now that's a lot of information, so let me simplify it in reference to one of my favorite whales, Alki, J36. Now Alki is a southern resident killer whale. She is a resident orca, which means she eats fish in the northern hemisphere of the world, specifically in the Pacific Northwest, in the waters of the Pacific Northwest of North America. She is a southern resident orca. That is the population that she's a part of. There's about 73 right now. They're an endangered population in Washington and Canada's waters. She doesn't have a clan. Now, southern resident killer whales do not have clans, whereas northern residents do. Southern and northern residents are different populations. They don't mix. But she does have a pod, and the pod is denoted in the first letter of her alphanumeric denotation. So that is J. She is part of J-pod. There are 2 other pods in the southern resident community, K and L. Now, within J-pod, right, we'll go one further down to the matriline. Her matriline is the J16s. Her mother, J16, is Slick. Matrilines are determined by social structure, which is largely focused around the matriarch of the group in most killer whale communities. Now, the alphanumeric code is used as a possessive to signify the group that usually travels together in any consistent avenue. Some whales not necessarily get adopted, but will travel with certain groups. So if you see the J16s, largely it means that it's Slick and Alki's siblings. But that doesn't mean that we can't have other animals that are around, but the J16 specifically talks about that one group of killer whales, a familial structure, if you will. Now, to explain the alphanumeric notation, it's different around the world, but usually you'll have an alpha, and this is saying to letter. So J, K, and L refer to the southern resident community, whereas A, G, and R are the clans for the northern residents. And then they have pods underneath that have different letters that will go as well. And then the number. The number is usually the amount of orcas that have been counted in that group up to this point. So Alki is J36, which means that she was the 36th whale denoted in the population of J-pod, in the pod, in J-pod. So she was 36, her mother J16 was 16th, so on and so forth. So from the top, Alki, J36, is part of J16's matriline in J-pod in the southern resident orca population, which means that she is a resident ecotype. Now, if you've never heard any of these terms before, and you've been able to follow me so far, congratulations. You know the basic fundamentals for the way that we categorize orcas globally. In some capacity, you'll know ecotypes, populations, matrilines, as people talk about these in different ways. and as I will throughout the rest of this series. Now from here, I want to go into the differences between ecotypes and populations and how they've evolved to their local biospheres. But in order to do that, we need to first go to the anatomy of an orca. Make sure we're on the same page. Starting with their face. Now, they have this beautiful, big, white patch just above their eye, and aptly so, it's called the eye patch. Their eyes themselves aren't that much bigger than ours, and in terms of their ability to see, it's not much different from us either, which is why when they spy hop, they can see out of the water on both sides. Under the water, it's not as great. They use echolocation in order to see under there. Now, if you move behind their head a little bit, you'll find a blowhole in the top back of their head. That's how they breathe, naturally. Their nose, over time, has evolved to go in the back of their head, which makes it a lot easier to breathe out of the water so they don't gotta really take their mouth out every time that they want to take a breath of fresh air. Now, they are mammals in the kingdom of Mammalia, right? They are not fish. They don't breathe through their gills because they don't have gills. They breathe through the blowhole. Now, behind their blowhole, you'll find their brain, which is huge. But to know where it is functionally within them, it's not in the front of their head in front of the blowhole. It's behind it, a little bit more protected. In the front of their blowhole, they have this thing called the melon. It helps organize a lot of the sound coming out that they're making for echolocation. Now that that's settled, it's worth telling you that you can tell the difference between a male and a female orca by looking at it upside down. Now, underneath, female orcas will have memory slits on both sides of, that we'll call like their opening, that you can identify an orca as female. So as little as, and this is extremely useful to know, especially to when an orca is a juvenile, to be able to understand population dynamics as things are going on, because as the orcas age, we will be able to know very clearly whether it is a male or a female based upon its dorsal fin size. Male orcas' dorsal fins are usually a lot larger than females. Their males stand between 4 and 6 feet at their highest, and females are between, I'd say, 1.5 to 2 and 3 or 4 feet. They're still quite large, but just like I said, not as quite as big as those males. Looking at an orca, there are a few things that stick out. Literally, they're called fins. The one on its back is called the dorsal fin. That's what I was just talking about with regard to the differences between male and female orcas. And then beneath, they have 2 pectoral fins, the equivalent of our hands, so to speak. They got big, long bones that go through there and a lot of tissue in between to help them swim. Males, again, are a lot bigger than females in that as well. And then, of course, orcas have their fluke, or their tail. They can be called fluke, called tailed, both are okay. Now, another identifiable aspect of orcas are their saddle patch. Now, this is the gray patch just behind their dorsal fin, and it can be very apparent. It can be separated, so, have open or closed saddle patches. Because each orca saddle patch is unique, it can be an indicator for anybody that is identifying an orca to be able to know the difference between them because of that. But we're going to get to identification in a second. I know I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, I'm going to stop myself right here before I go any further because there's a huge misconception about orcas that has to do with one of the things that I just talked about. And I'm going to imagine you already know what it is. In fact, I'll even let you guess. You have 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Dorsal fin collapse. Now, the conversation of dorsal fin collapse happens around orcas mainly because they have some of the biggest fins in the whole of the whale and dolphin families, right? Going up to 6 feet. There are orcas' dorsal fins that are taller than me. Maybe. You don't know yet. Of course, dorsal fin collapse is talked about in orcas because they have these large fins that do go through things. So, let's talk about some basics. Yes, it is a known trait for almost, if not all, orcas within captivity to some degree. Now, to understand even how it happens, you need to know what the dorsal fin is made up of, which is cartilaginous tissue. It's the same thing that's in our ears, right? It's not bone, and it's not something that can be intentionally manipulated by the whale themselves. Now, when an orca's dorsal fin collapses, it can happen for a number of reasons. But one of the main ones is a breakdown in cartilaginous tissue. Orcas, when they're in the wild, are able to swim really long distances and really deep depths. And so as they're doing this, a lot of the pressure of the water around them is helping to keep that dorsal fin up straight the entire time. Because when the orca goes far enough underneath or it's traveling for long enough distances, there is pressure on all sides of it. Whereas in captivity, there is a lot less depth and a lot less distance that an orca travels, therefore giving it more opportunity for gravity to do its job and help bend the fin over. Now, this does happen in the wild as well. I mean, take port and starboard. There are 2 orcas down in the southern west coast of Africa who eat sharks and shark liver, and both of them are aptly named for their oppositely flopped fins. Or you can look to the New Zealand population, where it has the greatest percentage of orcas with flopped fins in the whole world. A flopped fin may be able to tell you a lot about a killer whale, but it cannot tell you its mental state. Dorsal fin collapse does not happen because an orca is depressed. It's akin to saying the dolphins are happy because they smile, which is fundamentally a shitty argument. Now, putting dorsal fin collapse aside, the last thing I want to talk to you about is countershading. Orcas are black and white, and to a degree that's intentional. They're black on the top, right? So when you're looking down at an orca, it is camouflaged to the deep, dark ocean beneath it. Whereas if you're underneath and you see the white beneath, or the white above your beneath, you can see the white against the white background of the sun. The blue sky, right? The brighter kind of area that is. And the countershading is meant to help not hide them from predators, but to hide them from prey. Now that we've got anatomy down, we can focus on another weird aspect that is different between populations, but also seemingly similar in different parts of the world. Hunting. So let's go into a basic overview for global populations of orcas' hunting techniques that you may have seen to help give them a little bit more context. Okay, so orcas around the world eat different things, and some orcas in the same waters eat different things, have different diets, right? So we were talking about residents and transients. It's the most straightforward example of two different kinds of hunting and predation preferences that there are. Transients are mammal eaters. They eat seals, sea lions, pinnipeds, those are seals and sea lions, as well as other dolphins, and sometimes even larger whales. Residents, on the other hand, specifically eat fish. Now, the southern residents and the northern residents like their Chinook salmon specifically. It is the largest fish there is. That means when they catch it, there is the most amount of fish per catch that all of the animals can have. It's very important. Now, there are other populations around the world that also eat fish. Those are also considered residents within the northern ecotype, right? We have Atlantic residents, so the orcas in Norway will eat herring. Those are the ones you'll see gathering bait balls of herring together, shining the bottom of their bodies, which are the white, like I mentioned before, to get the herring to swim in a ball around and keep tightening until they tail slap to stun the fish that they can go and pick off nice and easily. Now, just further south of Norway, we have the Gladys killer whales. The Iberian orcas is just the larger population. This is, part of the population that you've heard of sinking ships. I have a video on that if you want to learn more about them specifically. Now, those ones eat Atlantic bluefin tuna. The orcas both in, Spain and Morocco, those are the Iberian orcas, as well as the orcas on the west side of the Atlantic Ocean, which is the east side of North America, also eat tuna. Now, there are other orcas within this area that are multi-dimensional eaters, is the best way I can put it. Can't think of a better term right now, but they eat fish, they eat marine mammals, and other things. On the west coast of North America, if we go a little bit further down to the California transients, those ones will eat whales. Those are mammal eaters mostly. But sometimes you'll see them take younger whales, usually calves, away from their mothers and specifically eat the tongue for those. But those aren't the only animals or population, let's say, that does that. One of the most famous examples and stories that exist between humans and killer whales actually has to do with whaling. There was communities in Australia. This is called The Killers of Eden, is the name of the book or whatever media exists about this symbiotic relationship between orcas and humans, where human people wanted to go and hunt humpback whales or larger baleen whales for meat and oil and blubber and a whole bunch of other things. And the orcas would alert the whalers that they were corralling a whale into the harbor that they were at. Now, the whalers would see, there was one orca that would come in, specifically Old Tom, as well as others throughout, but Old Tom was a consistent kind of character throughout this. He was the whale. Would come in and make a big show and tell people, to alert the whalers that they were bringing the whale in. The whalers would get their ship ready, they'd make their way out, and they would finish the kill so that the orcas didn't have to. But in order to aid in the reciprocity of this agreement between humans and orcas, they would tie down the humpback or whatever baleen whale they caught to be able to be hunted or eaten by the orcas that helped bring it in and alert them to the fact that they had it. As that would go, the orcas would go up and they'd specifically eat the tongue and the jaw. There's usually only one part of any animal that an orca is really particular about trying to prey on. It's usually the most fatty or the most nutritiously dense. And for larger whales, it's that. And so this became known as the law of the tongue for down there. But that all to say that there are mammal-eating orcas also down in Australia and in other parts of the world. You also may have seen orcas beach themselves onto, well, beaches, specifically, stranding themselves to try and get seals. Now, this is going up and trying to grab seal pups or larger animals that are just in the shoreline to be able to take them and bring them out. Now, orcas do this in Patagonia, specifically off of Punta Norte, around that area, and then beyond that, this also happens in the Crozet Islands. This is just off of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean as well. And these are two populations that don't intermix. They're quite far apart, but we see the same behavior exhibited, not unlike the humpbacks that I mentioned earlier. Now, there are other populations that are more hyper-specialized, like the New Zealand orcas, who not exclusively, but really do hunt rays and skates and other kind of bottom feeders there. They'll go, and you've probably seen the video of an orca tail slapping a stingray, looking out for Steve Irwin. Seriously, these orcas are great. Of course, we also have the orcas that go through ice flow. They've developed the technique of swimming together to form a wave that then pushes the seal or sea lion off of the ice flow, if not breaking it so that it has a smaller place in order to hang on to or stay on. Now, I've just named a few different places around the world where these different techniques exist, and there's more orcas like port and starboard, for instance, off the west coast of Africa, that will take sharks specifically for their liver. And all of these animals and these populations have developed these techniques over hundreds, if not thousands of years, specializing to their very, very local ecology and the balances of nature that come with that. But even though we just touched on orcas in every single ocean of the world, that's still not a complete picture of the entirety of orcas. And, if I wanted to go into that, which I will, it's not going to be in this video. But even in the short amount of time, it's not that hard to realize how vastly different a lot of these populations are from each other, even in the same waters. Now, but that begs the question, if these animals are so different and they're within the same waters, how can we tell the difference without having an individual tag in an orca that tells us technologically where they are and who they are and otherwise? And the answer to that is photo identification. This is a technique used by every single researcher on orcas throughout the world, and it was founded in British Columbia by a man named Dr. Michael Big. And in order to understand how he came to create the photo identification technique, we need to go back to 1965. In 1965, there was a storm that rolled through the northern part of British Columbia, above Vancouver Island. Now, the storm ended up tearing up some fishermen's gear. They woke up the next morning to find their gear was placed at the end of a cove, and inside of the cove was a killer whale. A year prior, an orca was at the Vancouver Aquarium, was held by the Vancouver Aquarium at the least, for 2 months. This was an orca that was harpooned off the coast of Saturna Island and towed by a harpoon from there to Vancouver. Now, because there was a lot of public kind of attention around this whale, Moby Doll, they thought the Vancouver Aquarium might be interested in purchasing a whale. And so they called over the Vancouver Aquarium, the fisherman that is, and said, "Hey, do you want to buy a killer whale?" The Vancouver Aquarium said, "Absolutely not. You are in Namur, British Columbia, way too far up north. I don't want anything to do with it. Not for me." They ended up calling another guy, Ted. Now, he was the owner of the Seattle Aquarium and was actually on the hunt for a killer whale. He really wanted one. He had actually tried before to go and capture one unsuccessfully. So this was an opportunity of a lifetime. The fisherman offered Ted an ultimatum. If he was there within 24 hours with $8,000 in cash, they would give the whale to him. So Ted, not having too much money at the time, starting an aquarium himself, went around Seattle asking people to fund bringing a killer whale down to his aquarium at the time. Going asking local shops, local business people, anybody that would give him some cash at the time in order to go up. And so he gathered $8,000 in a pillowcase and flew up to Namur, British Columbia. Now, it's important to remember that in 1965, people were shooting at killer whales. The Navy had an order out that if you were in the water with an orca, you were all but dead. It was a guarantee that your life was over because this animal kills anything in sight. Then immediately. It was not an animal that was loved nor cared for in any way, shape, or form by Western civilization. And like I said, understood and believed to be a demon of the sea. So once he gets up there, he thinks this is going to be a really easy transaction, and one of the fishermen stops and decides that there's one thing that needs to happen in order for the fisherman to know that Ted is very serious about taking care of this whale and taking it under his care. And so he challenges Ted to an arm wrestle for the final purchase of the killer whale, to know that he is serious enough to do it. And Ted won. And that is how the first killer whale was ever purchased. Now, as soon as the purchase happened and they were trying to figure out how to get this whale down to Seattle, it needed a name. And so one of the residents of the town decided that it would be a pretty apt name to call it Namu, after the city in which it was captured. And so that became its name. The whale was further from then on known as Namu. Now, at the time, the nets were still across the cove, and the large male killer whale that was inside had no way of being transported, and it had never been done before except by harpoon, like I said the year before. I swear this is about identification. Stick with me. What ends up happening, Ted gathers a team of people, and they build a floating net pen around the whale. Now, when they do this, they tow the net pen with him in it from Namu, British Columbia, down to Seattle. Now, Namu lives for about a year, and during that time, a lot of things happen. One of the most important things is that it's the first time that somebody gets into the water with a killer whale. The first killer whale kind of show happens. Nobody at the time had been really looking out to be able to understand a full picture of what an orca looks like, how it acts, how it interacts with people, or otherwise. And so, having it in a public aquarium in such a large city as Seattle allowed the whole world to get a look. And in fact, in 1966, there was a National Geographic article that was put out called Making Friends with a Killer Whale that was huge in a lot of the conservation space of people coming to learn more about an animal that was otherwise a very fear-mongered mystique, or that otherwise had a fear-mongered mystique. And this animal was so beloved and changed the hearts and minds of so many people that even in the year that it was in Seattle, they made a film called Namu, My Best Friend, in which the whale in the film was captured and then freed. Now, while Namu is in Seattle, Ted is looking for a mate for this whale. So he goes out and captures the first killer whale intended for captivity ever. He finds a young female, separates it from its mother, and brings it into the tank or sea pen with Namu. Now, the two of them didn't quite get along, and it didn't seem like that was going to be feasible long term. And so Ted was looking for greater options and opportunities to be able to sell this whale. Now, there was one aquarium that was particularly interested from San Diego, and they made their way up and struck a deal with Ted for the small female. And as they were doing it, part of the deal that they wanted to make was for the rights to the name Namu, because it was such a household name at that point. Ted didn't want to give that name up, understandably so, with the fame that it had accrued within the population, right? And also to the name of his whale that he developed a relationship with. But that didn't stop the company from trying to take a likeness in some way. So, the brightest minds came up with the greatest thing they possibly could at the time, which was She Namu. Shortened, of course, to Shamu. And Shamu, being as great of a name as it was given to the first whale that was ever captured intentionally and sold for captivity. Now, after this, the captivity industry for orcas began in the Pacific Northwest. Both Ted and others started capturing orcas around the Pacific Northwest and selling them to various aquariums, both in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. And about 5 years later, after this industry began, you had the Canadian government decide that they needed more regulation. Not necessarily to stop, but to know the stock of killer whales that they were dealing with. And in order to do that, they needed a census. You needed to know how many killer whales there were. Because at the end of the day, this is a fisheries, right? So the Department of Fisheries and Oceans hires Dr. Michael Bigg to do a census for killer whales in the Pacific Northwest. Now, at this time, people think there's thousands within the waters of Washington and British Columbia and Alaska. They think there are so many going through at any given point. So Michael Bigg comes up with the idea that one day a year, he was going to give out paper, a form to everybody all up and down the coast of British Columbia specifically, as he was operating in Canada. Everybody would look out on a specific day, I believe it was August 1st or 2nd, to count how many killer whales they saw, if they did at all. This was handed to fishermen, lighthouse keepers, people that lived on the coastline, tugboat operators, anybody that was around the vicinity. And then, after the day was over, and he would gather up all those forms, and they'd have them sent back to the Pacific Biological Station in Nanaimo, where he was stationed, he would begin to count. Now, he was on this project for many years, and over the years from 1970 on, he began to gather the information about the census of orcas, and as he was doing this, started photographing them. He started gathering more and more data, but also realizing patterns in the photos that he was taking, and him and his colleagues, that is, where all of a sudden, some of the dorsal fins that he's seeing, he's starting to recognize or see multiple iterations of, seeing that these animals are coming consistently to a lot of the areas that he's surveying. So in order to prove his hypothesis, he worked together with one of the captors to get one of the larger males and cut 2 large notches into its fin, the dorsal fin, the one on its back. The idea behind this is that if this whale was released and it kept the 2 notches on the back of its fin, then it was functional proof that orcas' markings can remain consistent over time. Even if they do change, it's going to be because of some other instance. But if there is a mark, it will remain unless further kind of damaged. So all of a sudden, in a population where the thought was that there were thousands, we could tell based on photographs not only how many there were, but who they are, how consistent they're around, and follow these individuals throughout their lives, especially too if they come back to the same places. And this, the photo identification and identity of orcas being different populations, not intermixing between residents and transients here in the Pacific Northwest, and then beyond that into the specific pods and mature lines that come from there, it was revolutionary to all of orca biology as far as it existed. He is the father of it. And he wasn't working on this by himself, of course. He had a team of various people, 2 of which were John Ford and Graham Ellis. Now, John Ford was a bioacoustician, and he ended up having hydrophones in the water, especially too for northern residents, I believe, in the beginning, to start categorizing the calls for killer whales, noting the differences between not only the calls that they would do and categorizing them down, but also, too, the fact that different populations had different calls, different clicks, the different way that they moved throughout the water. And so if you've ever heard that orcas have different vocalizations and different languages, so to speak, that also started around the same period of time. And if you want to learn more about the acoustics of killer whales, Orca Lab is a great place to go. It's a acoustic and non-invasive lab up in Hansen Island in British Columbia, and they have hydrophones, they have live cameras both above and beneath the water that you can go and look through old data of killer whale acoustics and how they've categorized them, as well as live feeds if the orcas are going by. Now, through this research and other instances that occurred between Washington and British Columbia, both outlawed captivity for orcas, at least the active capture of orcas within our waters. It slowly moved its way over time as regulations have caught up with it in each place. Now, just as the industry of capturing orcas has changed and shifted over time, so has the global populace's view on what orca captivity is and what it should be. Now, that said, the status of captivity around the world isn't the same, and it varies not only by location, but by country. More specific. Now, this, of course, brings us into one of the larger topics for orcas in our world, which is captivity. So let's go through a basic overview of what exists in the world today. As of the time that I'm filming this in February of 2025, there are currently 14 facilities worldwide that hold orcas in captivity. Now, 5 of those are currently being phased out. The 5 are SeaWorld, all of them, so that's Orlando, San Antonio, and San Diego. They've ended their breeding program, and so the orcas that are in their care will be the last ones ever in the United States. The other is Argentina with Shemenk. He's a singular orca that exists there, and then once he passes, he will be the last orca in captivity in Argentina at that facility, or in all of South America. And the 5th is Marineland Antibes, who, right now, has actually permanently shut down and is trying to figure out what to do with their orcas. Now, at this time, they're planning on either sending them to Loro Parque, or, like I said, as of today in February of 2025, there has been a proposal of them going to a marine sanctuary, or the French government building a marine sanctuary somewhere around the country, but right now that doesn't exist. The Whale Sanctuary Project has been a project going out of Nova Scotia in Canada. They also do not have a facility currently, even though they had a bid in to take in the 2 whales at Marineland Antibes right now, Wiki and Keijo. That facility was also refused and in fact is not even a facility yet. They don't have any infrastructure in place. There's only one other sanctuary that exists that is in the process of being built as well, called the Double Bay Sanctuary in British Columbia. Now, that one also is not fit at this current moment to take killer whales as far as I understand. Again, as of right now. The other 7 facilities are throughout China mainly, and then Japan and Russia. Now that's a basic overview of where captive orcas exist around the world. Now, the one thing I want to assure you of right now is that you can't release captive orcas into the wild that have been in captivity for the greater majority, if not all, of their life. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean they can't go to sea pens, but there's multiple instances that need to be taken into account for any orca that does. At this point, there's only ever been one orca released back into the wild, and the success, so to speak, of that release is up for heavy debate for what people consider to be an ethical release or otherwise. And that was Keiko, the whale that starred in the first movie for Free Willy. And even when he was released, he never reconnected with his pod. He was by himself and seeking out the help of humans throughout his entirety of his time in the wild, until he died a few years later of pneumonia in Norway. Now, for any news you see of captive orcas moving forward, the one thing I'd encourage you to do is try to understand for any specific orca what that situation would entail and look like, both from its experience historically, wherever it has been, and then to wherever it would go. That was a lot of the big stuff, the classification of orcas, the anatomy, basic hunting strategies around the world. We were looking at the history of human orca relationships and kind of how we came to learn the research about them, or learn to research them, and then captivity, which is a pretty solid foundation at the very least for understanding this species that has so many different facets to it. But to finish off, we're going to go through a few different statistics that are true for at least the whole species. The first is major motion pictures. There have been 6. The first was Namu, My Best Friend. That was about 1966, 1967. There was Orca. That was 1977 with Richard Harris. That was a Jaws-esque film that came out around then. There was the trilogy of Free Willy. That was 1, 2, and 3, 93, 95, 97. All with the same character, Jesse, as Jason James Richter, with the real whale, Keiko, in the first one. And then, of course, Free Willy Pirates Cove, which will be the last time you ever hear me mention it on this channel. We love Bindi Irwin. That movie burned it. Globally, there are around 50,000 killer whales in total. Individual populations, like I said, number in various instances. There are orca populations that are endangered. There are populations that are threatened. There are populations that are critically endangered. These are different denotations on the ICUN Red List, as well as other lists throughout different countries, depending on where the populations themselves are. As for threats that have to do with the species, there are some that are global, and there are some that are local. Some global instances that are going on right now are noise pollution. We have a lot of shipping lanes around. Windmills have been said by NOAA to not have any relation to cetacean deaths. So noise pollution that is happening within the water in any instance is going to be happening from ships, not windmills. That should be known. Beyond that, there is lack of prey in certain areas. So for us in the Pacific Northwest, there is a significant lack of prey of Chinook salmon for our southern resident community, and in other populations, we're starting to see that as well now. Pollution in general. Orcas are some of the most contaminated animals that exist, especially through biomagnification. So fish eat a lot of plankton, seals eat a lot of fish, orcas eat a lot of seals. And so as that happens and the body is consecutively processing all of these different chemicals in, especially to the blubber tissue of these animals, that ends up having adverse effects over time with regard to how many pollutants are stored in an orca's body. This can be seen especially too in how much a mother reduces the amount of toxins in her body when she has a calf and is nursing. And so she'll lose up to 50 to 70% of those toxins within her body within her first or second birth and lactation throughout that period of time. The gestation and lactation helps exude those toxins from her body, putting it into the calf. Of course, we also have climate change that is affecting orcas both in Antarctica and around the world as ecologies are changing in different areas. And finally, animosity, where you have people putting fuel into the water where orcas are or actually shooting at them. In certain instances with the past 2 years, people have actually been detained for such things. Now, there's always a question of what can we do? How can I help the orcas that exist? And there's a few different ways that you can. The first, which is the thing that a lot of us are doing now in February 2025, is conscious purchasing. The less that you purchase from places where they need to ship overseas or go long distances, the better. Because we are in a time of overconsumption in so many different ways. And so figuring out how to lessen or buy locally makes a huge difference in the impact of noise pollution going around, ship strikes for orcas and other cetaceans and all other animals in the ecosystem. The next thing I'd like to point you to is local conservation involvement. Look to your community, your city, your province, your state, your country, whatever it is that you're a part of, to try and help the local ecology around you. As much as we feel like the environment is so far from us, being able to take care of the place that we are in, that we're currently living in, is incredibly important. And the last is supporting research and conservation around these animals. There are a million different places, and some of the ones that I mentioned here, like I said, Washington, British Columbia, Alaska, Australia, California. There's so many different places where orcas exist that research is being done and conservation efforts are had. And so supporting all of the people doing work in those, some of which I'll list in the description below, you can go to and learn more about. And I think we'll leave it there for episode 1. This is the start of a series that I'm hoping to continue forward with, to just give you a basic fundamental understanding of the conversations that people are having around orcas, what identification looks like. We're going to get into that. We're going to get into captivity. We're going to get into the perception of orcas, as well as more specific differences within the populations, both in the Pacific Northwest and around the world. So if you haven't yet, subscribe to hear more about killer whales moving forward on this channel. And if you'd like to support more, we have a Patreon where we'll put some behind the scenes and some other things that I have in the works. Again, my name is Fred, and I'm the Orca Man. Thank you for joining me in the world of orcas, and I hope to see you again. Have a good one. Yeah, I'm really excited to continue exploring the world of orcas together. We're going to have a lot of fun. And I think that's a wrap.